I want you to imagine being 24 years old, finally getting your first real apartment, your first taste of independence. You're working 2 jobs to afford it. You've got your whole life ahead of you. And then you meet your neighbor. Not the friendly kind who brings cookies. No, the kind who threatens to call the police because he heard you sneeze. The kind whose cold eyes follow you every time you walk down the hallway. The kind who makes you check your door 3 times before bed because you genuinely don't feel safe. That was my reality. My name is Jordan, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the cruelest people are just carrying the heaviest pain. Please, before we continue, do me one favor. Hit that like button so stories about compassion and second chances can reach more people. And if you're new here, subscribe. What happens in this story will change how you see the angry people in your life. Let me tell you about Mr. Price. I moved into apartment 304 on a Tuesday in March. It was a small place in an old 4-story red brick building built in the 70s. The black fire escape clung to the front like a skeleton. The glass double door at the entrance had a crack running through it. The intercom was broken, wires dangling. But it was mine. The rent was cheap enough that I could afford it while working at the warehouse during the day and doing food delivery at night. My girlfriend Sarah, who worked as a nurse, helped me move my few pieces of furniture up the narrow stairwell to the 3rd floor. The hallway had faded floral wallpaper, cream and brown, peeling at the corners. Worn brown carpet ran down the center. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering constantly. The apartment doors were painted dark brown, the paint chipping away to show layers of old colors underneath. Mine was 304. My neighbor's was 305. I met Mr. Henry Price within an hour of moving in. I was carrying a box of books when I heard the door next to mine creak open. I turned and saw him. 58 years old, but he looked older. Pale, weathered skin covered in age spots. Thinning gray hair combed carefully over a bald spot. Cold, pale blue eyes with heavy bags underneath that stared at me with immediate suspicion. His face was gaunt and angular, hollow cheeks, deep wrinkles carved around his mouth from what looked like years of frowning. He was tall, 6 feet, but he stood with a stooped posture, hunched forward. Thin, almost frail, maybe 155 pounds. He wore a beige cardigan sweater that was pilled and worn, a white button-up shirt that had yellowed with age, brown corduroy pants, and brown leather slippers. In his shaking right hand, he gripped a wooden cane, dark mahogany with a brass handle shaped like a lion's head. The wood was worn smooth from years of use. "You're making too much noise," he said. His voice was raspy, cold. I blinked. "I'm sorry, I'm just moving in. I'll try to keep it down." "See that you do." He looked me up and down with disgust, then retreated back into his apartment. The door slammed shut. Sarah came up behind me. "Well, he seems friendly," she said sarcastically. I shrugged it off. Every building has one difficult neighbor, right? I had no idea what was coming. The first real incident happened my second day there. I was unpacking in my small living room. The hardwood floor was scratched and worn. The beige walls were bare except for one window with thin white curtains. I had a second-hand brown fabric couch with sagging cushions, a wooden coffee table covered in water rings, a small TV sitting on a cardboard box, and a bookshelf I'd made from cinder blocks and wooden planks. I was listening to music on my phone. Not loud, just background noise while I organized my books. Suddenly, bang, bang, bang. The wall shook. I jumped so hard I dropped the book I was holding. Then came muffled shouting through the wall. "Turn that noise off. Have some respect." I immediately turned the music off, my hands actually shaking. My heart was pounding. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like he was listening, waiting for me to make another sound. I texted Sarah. "I think my neighbor just lost it over some quiet music." She replied, "Just ignore him. He'll calm down." But he didn't. The next morning, I woke up at 6 to get ready for my warehouse shift. I took a shower, trying to be as quiet as possible. But apparently, I wasn't quiet enough. Bang, bang, bang on the wall. It's 6 in the morning. People are trying to sleep. I stood there in my towel, dripping wet, staring at the wall in disbelief. 6 in the morning. A completely normal time to shower before work. And he was banging on the wall like I was throwing a party. When I left my apartment at 6:30, I found a note slipped under my door. handwritten in aggressive black ink on white paper. Your morning routine is unacceptable. Show consideration for others. My stomach dropped. That was just the beginning. Over the next week, the notes multiplied. I come home from work to find 2, 3, sometimes 4 notes shoved under my door. Your footsteps are too heavy. I can hear you talking on the phone. Keep your voice down. You came home at 10 p.m. last night. That's too late. You woke me up. Stop slamming your door. I wasn't slamming my door. I was closing it normally. I started walking on tiptoes in my own apartment. I stopped listening to music entirely. I talked on the phone in whispers. I started taking showers at odd hours, trying to find a time that wouldn't upset him. I came and went from my apartment as quietly as a ghost. But nothing was good enough. He started banging on the wall at random times. Sometimes when I was just sitting on my couch reading. Sometimes when I was cooking dinner and a pot would clink against the stove. Sometimes when I was doing absolutely nothing and the building itself would creak and he'd somehow blame me for it. Then he escalated. One evening, I was at work doing a food delivery and Sarah called me, her voice shaking. "Jordan, your neighbor called the police." "What?" "He told them you were having a loud party and disturbing the peace. 2 officers just knocked on your door." I was inside and I let them in. I explained you weren't even home. They looked around, saw there was no party, and left. "But Jordan," he filed a noise complaint. A false one. I felt my blood run cold. A false police report. Over nothing. When I got home that night, I found another note. "The police will be back if you don't learn to live quietly." I barely slept that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the building, terrified that any sound would trigger another call to the police, another complaint, another confrontation. Sarah stayed over the next few nights because I told her I genuinely didn't feel safe. And she saw it herself. The wall banging. The notes. The way Mr. Price would open his door whenever he heard me in a hallway and just stare at me with those cold blue eyes, not saying anything, just watching with this look of pure contempt. "This is harassment," Sarah said. "You need to report him." I went to the building manager, showed him the notes, told him about the false police report. The manager, a tired-looking man in his 40s, just sighed. "Look, Mr. Price has lived here for 30 years. He's complained about every neighbor he's ever had. Honestly, most people just move out after a few months because it's not worth the fight. I can talk to him, but it won't change anything. So I'm just supposed to live like this?" He shrugged. "You're not breaking any rules. You're not being loud. He's just a difficult old man. Try to ignore him." But how do you ignore someone who's making your life a living hell? I started avoiding my apartment. I'd work as many delivery shifts as possible at night, just so I didn't have to be there. When I was home, I moved as little as possible, barely breathed, existed like a shadow. I lost weight from stress. Dark circles formed under my eyes. I was constantly on edge, constantly anxious. Sarah noticed. "This isn't healthy. You can't live like this." "I don't have anywhere else to go," I said quietly. "I signed a year lease. I can't afford to break it." Then came the night that changed everything. It was 2 in the morning on a Thursday. I was lying in bed, finally about to fall asleep after hours of anxiety, when I heard something through the wall. Not banging, not shouting, crying. Deep, broken, gut-wrenching sobs. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was coming from Mr. Price's apartment. He was crying. Not just crying, weeping. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep and painful that it shakes your entire body. I lay back down, but I couldn't unhear it. For hours, the crying continued. Sometimes it would quiet down, and I'd think it was over, and then it would start again, even harder. When morning came, I was exhausted, but something had shifted inside me. I'd spent 8 months terrified of this man, hating him, wishing he'd just disappear. But that sound, those sobs, they didn't sound like they came from a cruel person. They sounded like they came from someone who was shattered. I started paying attention differently. Not to his anger, but to everything else. I noticed that every Tuesday at exactly 2 in the afternoon, he left the building carrying a small canvas bag. He'd walk down the street, hunched over his cane, and disappear around the corner. He'd be gone for about 2 hours. I noticed that his hands shook constantly, a slight tremor that made simple tasks difficult. I noticed that he walked with a limp, favoring his right leg. I noticed that late at night, I could sometimes hear him talking, but there was never another voice. He was alone in there, talking to himself or to someone who wasn't there. And I noticed that every few nights, the crying would come again. Always late, always when he thought no one could hear. The following Tuesday, I did something I probably shouldn't have. When Mr. Price left his apartment at 2 p.m. with his canvas bag, I quietly followed him. I stayed far back, watching as he walked 6 blocks through the neighborhood. His pace was slow, painful even, each step seeming to cost him effort. He never looked back. He just walked with purpose, like he'd done this walk 1,000 times. He stopped at a cemetery. I watched from behind a large oak tree as Mr. Henry Price walked through the iron gates and along a winding path between graves. He finally stopped at one near the back, partially shaded by a bare tree. He stood there for a moment, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, then slowly, carefully lowered himself to his knees. The movement looked agonizing, his whole body trembling with the effort. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out fresh white lilies. He placed them gently on the grass in front of the headstone, arranging them with shaking hands like they were the most precious thing in the world. Then he began to talk. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see his lips moving, see the way his shoulders shook, see him wipe his eyes. I waited until he left, then walked over to the grave. The headstone was simple gray marble. It read, Margaret Louise Price, beloved wife, January 14th, 1955 to March 8th, 2022, forever in my heart until we meet again. My chest tightened. March 2022, just over 2 years ago, right around the time I'd heard he'd started complaining more, driving neighbors away. She died 2 years ago, and he'd been alone ever since. Everything suddenly made sense. The anger wasn't about noise. It was about silence. His apartment was too quiet without her. The complaints weren't about me. They were about life continuing when his had stopped. The hatred in his eyes wasn't really hatred. It was grief with nowhere to go. He wasn't cruel. He was drowning. I stood there in that cemetery for a long time, staring at Margaret's grave, thinking about all the notes, all the wall banging, all the cold stares. And for the first time in 8 months, I didn't feel anger toward Mr. Price. I felt heartbroken for him. That evening, I did something that everyone would probably call crazy. I went to a flower shop and bought a small potted plant. A peace lily, white flowers, green leaves, simple and beautiful. I also bought a card. I stood outside his door for 10 minutes, trying to figure out what to write. Finally, I just wrote the truth. Mr. Price, I'm sorry for your loss. I can't imagine the pain you've been carrying. If you ever want to talk, or if you ever need anything, I'm right next door. Jordan, apt 304-inch. I left the plant and the card outside his door and went back to my apartment. I didn't expect anything to happen. But the next morning, when I opened my door to leave for work, I found something sitting on my doormat. A small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a bookmark. Old, worn, clearly well-loved. It was leather with a pressed flower preserved inside clear laminate. On the back, in faded ink, were the words to Henry, Love always M. And underneath it, a note in shaky handwriting. She made this for me 30 years ago. Thank you for your kindness. I'm sorry for how I've treated you. I forgot how to be human. H. Price. I stood in that hallway holding that bookmark, and I just started crying. That afternoon, I knocked on his door. It took a while, but eventually it creaked open. Mr. Henry Price stood there in his beige cardigan and brown corduroy pants, leaning on his mahogany cane, looking smaller somehow, less frightening, just tired. Thank you for the plant, he said quietly. You're welcome. Would you like to come over for coffee? He hesitated, suspicion flickering in those pale blue eyes for just a moment. Then it faded, replaced by something else. Loneliness. Need. I would like that, he whispered. He sat on my worn brown couch, holding a mug of coffee in his shaking hands, and for the first time in 8 months, we actually talked. He told me everything. How he and Margaret had been married for 36 years. How they'd lived in apartment 305 for 30 of those years. How she'd gotten sick 2 years ago, cancer, and within 3 months she was gone. How his son lived across the country and called once a month but never visited. How he'd push away every friend they'd had because seeing couples together was too painful. How he'd become trapped in his apartment with nothing but memories and silence. Every sound from your apartment reminded me that life was continuing, he said, his voice breaking. People talking, laughing, music playing. And I wanted it all to stop. I wanted the world to be as silent and empty as my life had become. I know that's not fair. I know I've been terrible to you. But I didn't know how to handle the pain except to lash out at everyone around me. Why didn't you ever say something? I asked gently. Why didn't you tell someone you were struggling? He looked down at his coffee. Pride, stubbornness, fear. When you get to be my age and you lose the person who was your whole world, you feel like you've lost your purpose. I didn't want pity. I didn't want people trying to fix me. So I pushed everyone away until there was no one left. And then I hated myself for being alone, so I took it out on whoever was closest, which was you. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner, I said. How could you? He shook his head. I gave you no reason to see anything but anger. We sat in silence for a while, and then I asked, tell me about Margaret. What was she like? His face transformed. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw him smile. Just a small one, but it was there. She was stubborn as hell, he said with a soft laugh. Drove me crazy most days. But she was kind. She saw good in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. She'd have liked you. From that day forward, everything changed. Not overnight, but gradually. The notes stopped completely. The wall banging ended. When we passed in the hallway, Mr. Price would nod at me, and eventually, he started saying hello. I started checking on him. I knock on his door every few days to see if he needed anything. Groceries, help with something around his apartment, or just someone to talk to. Slowly, he opened up more. He started leaving his apartment more often. He stopped glaring at the other neighbors. He even apologized to the building manager for years of complaints. One evening, about 3 months after that first conversation, he knocked on my door holding a framed photograph. It was a black and white picture in a tarnished silver frame. It showed a young woman in her 30s with dark curled hair and a bright smile, wearing an 80s-style floral dress. This is Margaret, he said. I wanted you to see her, to know who she was. She was beautiful, I said. She was everything. He paused. I've been thinking about what she'd say if she saw how I've been acting these past 2 years. She'd be ashamed of me, but I think she'd also be proud that I'm trying to do better now. Because of you, I didn't do anything special. Yes, you did. He looked me in the eyes, and for the first time they weren't cold. They were grateful. You saw past my anger. You chose compassion when I deserved nothing but contempt. You gave me a reason to try again. That's everything. Sarah met him a few weeks later. She brought over dinner one night, and the 3 of us ate together in my small living room. She told me later, that's not the same man you described. He's completely different. He was never really that man, I said. He was just buried under grief. Mr. Price started joining us for dinner every Thursday. He taught me how to play chess, a game Margaret had loved. He told stories about the neighborhood from 30 years ago, when this building was new and the streets were different. He showed me photo albums filled with pictures of Margaret, and I could see the love in every image, every memory. One Saturday, I helped him clean out some of the clutter in his apartment. Stacks of yellowed newspapers, boxes of things he'd been hoarding. It was like he was finally ready to let light back in. I'm thinking about volunteering at the community center, he told me one afternoon. Margaret used to volunteer there, teaching people to read. I think I'd like to do something like that. Something that would make her proud. I think that's a great idea. Months passed. The seasons changed from spring to summer to fall. And Mr. Henry Price became someone I genuinely cared about. Not my scary neighbor. My friend. One October evening, he knocked on my door holding a small wooden box. I want to give you something, he said. Inside the box was his wooden cane. The dark mahogany one with the brass lion's head handle that he'd carried every single day since I'd known him. Margaret gave me this cane 20 years ago when I hurt my leg at work, he explained. I've carried it every day since, even after my leg healed, because it reminded me of her. But I don't need it anymore. Not physically and not emotionally. I want you to have it. I can't take this, I said. Please. His voice was firm but kind. You held me up when I was falling. You were my cane when I needed one most. Now I want you to have something that meant the world to me. So you remember that compassion matters. That seeing past someone's anger to their pain can save them. I took the cane, feeling the weight of it, the smooth worn wood, the detailed brass lion's head. Thank you, I whispered. That winter, Mr. Price started volunteering 3 days a week at the Riverside Community Center, helping adults learn to read. He made friends. He started to go to a grief support group. He began living again instead of just existing. And he never forgot what had changed everything. One evening, as we sat together watching the snow fall outside my window, he turned to me and said, "You know, I spent 2 years thinking my life was over. That without Margaret, there was no point in going on. I was just waiting to die. But you taught me something important. Life doesn't end when we lose someone we love. It changes. It hurts like hell, but it doesn't end. And there are still people worth knowing. Still reasons to wake up in the morning. Still chances to be better." He paused, his pale blue eyes, once so cold, now warm and grateful. "You saved my life, Jordan. Not by fixing me, but by refusing to give up on me when everyone else had, including myself." I didn't know what to say, so I just reached over and squeezed his shoulder. We sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found an unexpected friendship in the most unlikely circumstances. All because one person chose to see pain instead of just anger. All because one person chose to stay instead of running away. All because one person understood that sometimes the cruelest people are just the most broken. And sometimes all they need is someone who sees them, really sees them, and says, "I'm here. You're not alone." That's the power of compassion. That's the power of refusing to give up on people. That's what it means to be human.